To this now, the UN Security Council is to vote on a US-drafted resolution supporting a Gaza ceasefire proposal that it says would bring a full and immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. The US mission to the United Nations has again emphasized that implementation of the deal would enable an immediate ceasefire for 6 weeks and the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. It would also see Israeli forces withdraw from populated areas in the first phase, while increasing humanitarian relief. Sharon Rice-Peace reports that this push in New York comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken landed in the region with stops in Egypt, Israel, Jordan and Qatar.
Washington's top diplomat landed in Israel Monday after an earlier stop in Cairo, Egypt, where he's pressing leaders in the region to pressure Hamas to agree to the current ceasefire proposal on the table.
The only party that has not accepted, the only party that's not said yes, is Hamas. That's who everyone's waiting on. That's who the Palestinians in Gaza are waiting on. It's who the Israelis are waiting on. It's who the hostages and the hostage families are waiting on. It's who the entire region and the entire world is waiting on. And so we'll see. Does Hamas want to end this conflict, end this war that it started, or not? We'll find out. But it's clear that virtually the entire world has come together in support of the proposal. And the only open question is, will Hamas say yes?
But there is some dispute as to what Israel has agreed to, after comments from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the war would not end until Israel had completely destroyed Hamas's military and governance capabilities in Gaza. Far-right members of his cabinet also accused the PM of trying to whitewash the deal and threatened to pull out of his coalition government, essentially collapsing it, were he to move ahead with a three-phased proposal. This US envoy pressed on whether the initial 6-week pause was sufficient to win over skeptical council members who are seeking a permanent ceasefire in the initial phase of the agreement.
Yes, there'll be differences of opinion on, which side wants this and which side wants that, but overall this proposal, I think, is the best realistic opportunity. We want to put pressure on Hamas to accept this deal. So far it hasn't accepted this deal, so that's why we want to have this resolution, because we think right now we're on the cusp of doing something very, very important, and so we want to see it done, and that's why we're working so hard to try to get everybody on board.
The current proposal would see an initial first phase ceasefire for 6 weeks, in which some Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners would be exchanged, humanitarian relief scaled up, and some withdrawal of Israeli forces from populated areas, as mediators worked to secure agreement on the second and third phases, which could, upon further agreement of the parties, lead to a permanent ceasefire, the full withdrawal of Israeli troops, and finally, the reconstruction of Gaza as part of Phase 3.
There is no safety within Gaza, and it's a very tragic situation. And to answer the last question that you have asked, any initiative that leads to a ceasefire, that leads to an ending of what's happening now is, of course, welcome. We can only hope that that is achieved, because the humanitarian situation bears words. We don't even know how to describe it anymore. It is beyond precarious. It is beyond catastrophic.
And after an Israeli raid this past Saturday freed 4 hostages in central Gaza, while reportedly killing more than 250 Palestinians in the process, it's unclear what that could mean for generating goodwill between the parties. Sharon Rice-Peace, SABC News, New York.
Sharon joins us now from UN headquarters in New York. Sharon, thank you so much for your time. We have a vote scheduled for later this evening, begging the question, will it pass given concerns expressed by some countries around the permanence of the ceasefire in the initial phase?
So we're about 2 hours and a little bit more, Bongi. We're away from a potential vote here, and I just heard from a US diplomat, quote, "We are hoping it will pass." But even that message doesn't give us a complete picture here, right? It's a very a complex response here because negotiations often continue until the last moment. The Algerian ambassador walked outside of the council on his phone to his capital, talking about whether the Arab group has given its full support to this. proposal that is now before the Council. We understand that Russia and China has raised some concerns about why Phase 1 does not ensure the permanence of a ceasefire. It talks about a 6-week ceasefire that will allow for continued negotiations that could in Phase 2 see a more permanent structure, a more permanent cessation in hostilities, the withdrawal of the IDF in its entirety from Gaza. But they want clarity on whether Phase 1 essentially means Phase 2 and subsequently Phase 3 will happen. They want clarity from whether Israel has in fact accepted this proposal. There are quotes from U.S. envoys, including the Secretary of State in the region, now saying Israel is on board. But we've also heard from the Israeli Prime Minister and some of his right-wing cabinet ministers saying that they do not fully support this proposal and that they are threatening to withdraw from the Israeli government and collapse the government if, the demand is that Israel withdraw its forces before Hamas in its entirety is reduced to an entity that cannot again attack Israel and certainly cannot govern Gaza. So a lot of ifs and buts here. There's also some concern about the language in the resolution, Bongiwe. It uses words like reaffirm, recalls, underscores, welcomes, but you don't see language that demands of the parties. It welcomes a new ceasefire proposal, but isn't demanding that the parties implement it. And so that weakened language is raising questions about whether this will be legally binding on the parties or if this is sort of an escape, an off-ramp for parties not to implement. So a lot of questions here. Will the Russians abstain? Will they allow it to pass? Are we going to see another veto? The US still very optimistic for now.
And speaking about questions and developments, Sherwin, as you've pointed out there, the U.S. Secretary of State in the region to press leaders to pressure Hamas to accept the deal. But there's also, of course, the issue of the Emergency International Conference on the urgent humanitarian response to the crisis in Gaza. What are you learning?
Yeah, the big question here is, the central theme here is human suffering. Whether you're talking about the families of hostages, the hostages themselves, the families that are bereaved, having buried or not necessarily buried, some 36,000 plus dead in Gaza, the humanitarian consequences that this military operation 8 months in now has caused. And so a big push here from the United Nations, the mediators, the United States, Qatar and Egypt, for the ceasefire proposal that can really, in the main, relieve the humanitarian consequences on humans and human life in the main. And so you'll see tomorrow a conference that is being convened under the auspices of the United Nations, along with Jordan and others, to really focus on the humanitarian situation and what the long-term plan here, the collective response from the international community needs to be. We understand the Secretary General has landed in Jordan for that conference. His spokesperson previewed the trip, and this is what Stefan Dujarric had to say a short time ago.
The Secretary General arrived in Jordan not long ago. He is scheduled, as you know, to attend the high-level conference on Gaza that is being organized at the invitation of Jordan, of Egypt, and the United Nations. That conference will take place starting tomorrow in Jordan near the Dead Sea. In remarks the Secretary General is expected to deliver at the conference tomorrow, he will shed light on the deplorable situation in Gaza, the deplorable conditions in Gaza. As you may know by now, the conference is called A Call for Action, Urgent Humanitarian Aid for Gaza. The Secretary General is also expected to renew his calls for a ceasefire along the unconditional release of all the hostages still being held. On the margins of the conference, he will hold discussions with other leaders on the issue of both humanitarian and political level.
And just to wrap that thought, Bongiwe, the spokesperson also saying that the meeting aims to identify ways to bolster the international community's response to the humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip and commitments for a collective, coordinated response to address the situation. And a conference of this nature, of course, as you well know, cannot come fast enough.
And definitely not shown, but we'll continue to monitor this through your eyes. Thank you very much for that comprehensive update. That's my colleague there, Sherwin Brass-Peace, SABC News correspondent, coming to us live from the UN headquarters in New York.